All right, Chaver on Zoom, you still hear me all right? Excellent. All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the Shiurim and Drushos this month in honor of their grandchildren, Tikva, Esther, Simcha, Abigail, Milan, Millicenta. May they grow to become the best version of themselves. The Daf Yomi and Schus of Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal, our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin Fleischman in memory of his father, Reb Shmuel Yudel, Ben Binyamin Yaakov, Selma Wolf, with immense Hakaras Hatov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Refuah Shalema of her granddaughter, Dr. Carrie Davis, and our Daf Yomi sponsors, Matt and Rishona Leibovitz, in honor of the bris of Akiva Ben Sion this past Shabbos, and with tremendous Hakaras Hatov to the entire Kehillah. May Akiva Ben Sion and Meretz Hashem Bizocha to enter into Torah, to Chuppah, and to Maisim Tovim, and live a beautiful life of Kiddush Hashem Ameh Ve'esim Shanim Tovos. I will say with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf. The next couple of, as you've seen already, the last couple of days, next couple of days, we have some incredible, incredible sugyas. So today's daf is Mem Tes 49. We are picking up on Mem Chesed Base 48. We have a lot to do today. Let's actually pick up from the Meisvei on 48b, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. 26 lines up from the bottom. Probably easier to count from the top. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. So Mason, we actually started this yesterday, but let's just begin again. So just to remember, where are we holding over here? The Mishnah introduced us to this idea that once the father hands over the daughter, gives over the daughter to the shluchim, to the agents of the Baal, she has essentially entered into the domain of her husband. The machlokis that we were seeing, I forgot to, printed out something I forgot to go. So the machlokis that we were seeing in yesterday's daf is, I did it at home. The machlokis that we were looking at yesterday's daf is halacha l'maisa. What does that accomplish? In other words, when we say that she enters into the domain of her husband, what does that mean? Does that mean totally into the domain of her husband in all matters, or perhaps for certain matters but not for others? So for example, we've seen already a machlokes. Rav says it works for everything except for truma. So when she's handed over into the reshus of her husband, she's essentially in the domain of her husband, but halacha l'maisa, if her husband's a Kohen, she can't yet eat truma. That was Shmuel. Reish Lakish said for Kesuva. Again, we saw a number of different opinions. So the last two opinions we saw was Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina, who both held that halacha l'maisa, when she is given over from the father to the shluchim of the husband, she is totally in the domain of her husband, including for truma consumption. So that's what we're picking up over here. So if the father went with the shluchim of the Baal, or ultimately again the agents of the father went with the agents of the Baal, or she had, let's say again, so if the image is they're traveling now to the husband's home, they're traveling now to the chuppah, and let's say she had a chutzner on the way, v'nichnasa imo lalun, and she goes in with her husband to go ahead and spend the night. Now, I want to point out over here that Rashi points out, v'nichnasa imo in baila, now it's her husband because they've already had erusin, they have not yet had nisuin, and they're spending the night in this chutzner, kishar lina b'derech ba'alma, v'lo l'shem nisuin. So they're sleeping in the same place, but they're not sleeping together. In other words, that ultimately they're not spending the night together to affect nisuin. This is just a stop on the derech. Even though her ksuva, so to speak, is in the house of her husband. In other words, let's say the dowry has already been delivered to her husband. Mesa, if she dies on the way, aviha yarsha. Ultimately, again, her father goes ahead and inherits her. And I will say, why does her father, why does her father inherit her in this case? Because halacha l'maisa, remember again, the father is accompanying them along this journey. Okay, masra av l'shluchei habal. But if the father goes ahead and hands her over to the shluchim of the Baal, or ultimately, again, the agents of the father hand her over to the agents of the Baal, or halacha l'maisa, again, they're traveling, and he has a chutzner on the way, and they spend the night there, v'nichnasa imo l'shum nisuin, and they spend the night there together, to l'shem nisuin, to effect nisuin, afal pi shekesuvos beis aviha, even though the dowry property might still be in the house of her father, mesa, if she dies, baila yarsha. Ultimately, again, her husband inherits her. But if you notice over here in this brisa, so what is the discussion about? In other words, when we say that she's given over to her husband in the second case, essentially she's in the domain of her husband. What matter are we discussing? Lirushasa, in terms of who inherits her. Aval truma ein isha ocheles betruma acheti kanis l'chuppah. So we'll say what you see over here is at most. The discussion is what? The discussion is regarding halacha l'maisa, who's going to inherit her, right? If she dies on the way to her husband's home, who inherits her? So in case number one, where the father or the agents of the father are present, the father is going to inherit her. In case number two, where the father is not present, the agents of the father are not present, her husband inherits her. But if you notice, what never comes up in discussion? Truma. Why? Because everyone is going to agree, well, not everyone, because the Bryce is making it clear that halacha l'maisa, a woman doesn't eat truma until she enters into chuppah. Tiyufta dekulhu tiyufta. This ultimately, again, Rashi points out over here, refutes everyone. Rashi says it doesn't literally mean refutes everyone. It refutes everyone who's arguing on Shmuel. Because Shmuel was the one who said that halacha l'maisa, when the father hands her over to the husband, to the agents of the husband, at that point in time, the husband will inherit her. But halacha l'maisa, no discussion of truma. And I will point out over here, the Gemara is not going to go on to discuss a different matter of discussion, but l'maisa, this concludes the truma discussion. So how do we paskin? See, interestingly enough, tomorrow I'll share with you the lashon of the Rambam, but the Rambam has a beautiful lashon. The Rambam essentially says that halacha l'maisa is how we paskin, that there is no truma consumption until a woman enters into chuppah. Till a woman enters chuppah, till a woman enters into base baila. So only after complete nisuin is effected, and only after they are living together as husband and wife, does a woman have the ability to go ahead and eat truma. Then I will say we're going to see, up until now, remember, we went through this sugya a little bit. Mid'araisa, when could a woman begin to eat truma? Let's go through this just for a second. When could a woman begin to eat truma? Mid'araisa, right? Erisin, because ultimately, again, once she's kinyan kaspos, or once she's acquired by the husband, halacha l'maisa, she should be able to eat truma. Why don't we let her eat truma during erisin? We're concerned that since she's living in her father's home, what's going to happen? She's going to get truma from her chassan, and she's going to go ahead and end up sharing it with her Yisrael family. We're going to see there's another reason. We alluded to it in yesterday's daf. We're going to see the sugya, what we call simfon. What we're concerned about is that perhaps they're going to get married. He's going to discover some type of some type of blemish that is going to be cause for voiding of the marriage. And it turns out retroactively, the whole thing was a mekachtos. And therefore, if she's eating truma already, it turns out, forget about giving to her family. For her also, now it turns out that she's a Yisraelis who was consuming truma. So we haven't seen that second reason yet. The Gemara here has alluded to it. We'll get to that sugya, but the point is therefore the Rambam Paskins, halacha l'maisa, there is no truma consumption until after nisuin bebeis baila. Good. So now the Gemara is going to point out there was an interesting point in this Mishnah. Hagufa in this brisa, hagufa kasha. Amrit, we said before, nichnasa abosim. If remember again in the two cases in the brisa we had before, case number one, where they spent the night, she had a chatzra along the way. Second case, and again, the way the brisa phrased it was, they spent the night not l'shem nisuin, just because they were sleeping there that night. It was a long journey. Case number two is he had a chatzar, they spent the night, and they spent the night l'shem nisuin. So says the Gemara, haguva kasha, amrit nichnasa ima lalun, they spent the night, taima de lalun, hastam l'shem nisuin. So both say the reason why nisuin wasn't affected was because they made it explicitly clear that they were just spending the night because it was a long journey. Taima lalun, we're just staying here tonight, there's no nisuin. Hastama, if they would not have articulated that, we would have assumed that when Chassan and Kala spend the night together in the same place, that's for Nisuin. Ema Seifa, yet look at the Seifa. Nichnas Se'ima L'Shem Nisuin, Hastama Lalun. Yet, if you look at the Seifa, the second case, it said they went in L'Shem Nisuin. So it sounds like it has to be L'Shem Nisuin. Hastama, if there was no articulated purpose, we would assume they're just spending the night, not Nisuin. Amravashi, Stami Katani. Stam Chatzar Dida, Lalin. We'll say when they spend the night in her Chatzar, the assumption is they're not affecting Nisuin. Stam Chatzar Didei Linisuin. But if they spend the night in his Chatzar, the assumption is it is for Nisuin, which I will say makes sense. Why? Because as we're going to see when we get into our definitions of chuppah, but part of the concept of chuppah is that chuppah represents the rishus of the husband. The rishus of the husband. So therefore, again, what the Gemara is identifying over here is, if in this case, where father handed daughter over to the agents of the husband, they're traveling. Along the way, the husband has a chutzner. They spend the night in that chutzner. The assumption is the night they spend together in that chutzner, Nisuin is being affected. Why? Because you're spending it in the rishus of the husband. I'll point out to you, there are opinions in halacha that hold that, but when a chassan and kala get married contemporarily, and you have a chuppah, that the chassan himself is obligated to be kona, the area of the chuppah. He has to be socher, he has to rent from the caterer, from the hall, the actual area of the chuppah. Because the chuppah, according to some, represents the domain of the husband, the rishus of the husband, and therefore mamish, he has to be the owner of it. Just to show you, that's base baila. Okay, well, we'll see those suggestions as well. Tana, Masra Avlu Shulchi Habal Vizinsa. What's the interesting case? So now, father gave over his daughter to the shluchim of the husband, Vizinsa. And then Rabbi say, on the way, so now she's going back to the home of her husband, and on the way, she's mizana, she commits adultery. What's the halacha? Harezu b'chenek. Ultimately, again, she's killed by chenek. Now, we saw this already a couple of days ago. The punishment for adultery during erisin is skila. The punishment for adultery, ultimately, again, what we call after nisuin, is going to be chenek. Two different forms. So the idea over here is that since she's being punished by chenek, that seems to indicate to us that some level of nisuin has been affected by the mere handing over of the girl to the shluchim of the Baal. Look at Rashi. Harezu b'chanek kinesua v'lo b'skila ka'arusa. Rashi is about 5 lines up from the bottom, 6 lines up from the bottom. So you see over here, once she's handed over into the rishus of the husband, so we'll say, but what you begin to see is happening over here from the Mishnah is, essentially, once the girl is given over by her father, even to the shluchim of the husband, she has entered into the rishus of her husband for certain things, but not for others. So it's almost as if, it's a strange thing to say, but there's a quasi-nisuin that is affected, that makes her a nisuah for certain things, but not for other things. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, from where do we know this? So how do I know that once she's handed over to the agents of the husband, she effectively morphs into a nesua, to the point that if she committed adultery, now she would be punished by chenek. So the Gemara says, Liznos beis aviha. As the pasuk says, Rabbi says actually talk about the Naru Murasa, but it says Liznos beis aviha. She committed znus in her father's home. Prat, now said that's talk now by Na'ara HaMe'urasa, by a girl who's had erisin, who commits adultery. The pasuk says that she's killed by skila, by stoning. That's this pasuk. So the Torah says why? Because Liznos beis aviha. She gets skila because she committed znus in the home of her father. Prat l'shemasra avlu shluchei abal. This comes to exclude a case where the father has already given her over to the shluchim of the husband because she's no longer beveis aviha. And if she's no longer beveis aviha, therefore what? She's no longer punished by skila, rather she's punished by chenek. Maybe it comes to an excluded case where the girl has entered into the chuppah but has not yet had bia, and so therefore in that case halacha l'maisa. Halacha l'maisa, maybe in that case she's punished by chenek and not by skila. Amar Rava, Amar li ami chuppah behedjek siben. The chuppah is explicitly stated ki yihya na'ara besula ma'orasa leish. But when the Torah speaks about again the Na'ara Me'urasa. So the pasuk says, what do we learn out from this phrase? Me'urasa v'lo nesua. Erisin and not nisuin. My nesua. If you say it literally means nisuin, hayda besula, velo beula, elav shenichnas alachupa velo nivala. So we'll say therefore that from that phrase we can learn out that halacha. But from our phrase, liznos beis aviha, what do we learn? That when does a girl get skila for adultery? That's when she is in arusa, where? Living in her father's home. But once she is given over to the shluchim of the husband, even though what? Technically she's still in arusa, but that act of giving her over to the shluchim of her husband, essentially for punishment purposes, makes her what? Makes her what? A nisua, and therefore if she commits adultery, she'll be punished by chenek and not by skila. Okay, top of memtes, on to lighter matters. Ve'ima, hecha de hadra lebeinasha, hadra lemilsa kamaisa. And here's what's interesting. Okay, so now we've been dealing with this same case, right? Reuven's marrying Rachel, Mazel Tov. So what happens? Reuven lives in a faraway place, so he sends his agents, he sends his shluchim to go ahead and pick up his wife, escort her back to his home. Father gives over Rachel, ultimately again to the shluchim of the Baal. Let's say now, halacha l'maisa, on the way, whatever it is, Reuven dies. So now Rachel comes back home. Okay. So ve'ima hecha da hadra lebeinasha, hadra lemilsa kamaisa. I might have thought that if Rachel comes back home, maybe she regains her former Na'ara state. In other words, what happens in a case where after having handed over his daughter to the shluchim of the Baal, the marriage doesn't materialize? You both say, obviously, if Rachel goes to Reuven's home, they get married, they have nisuin, they get divorced, or she's widowed, of course she doesn't go back to her father's home. That's not a shaila, right? We're talking about over here, father gave her over to the agents of Reuven, and now on the way, Reuven died. So now, Eid Nebuch, agents go ahead now and bring her back home. Shluchim bring her back home. So I might have thought that now she comes back home, maybe she's once again just like a regular Nara, and therefore her father has all the same rights in her as he had as a Nara. Right, so Amarava, Hahu Kvar Paska Tana de Rabbi Shua. I'll say third line down from the top, Mem Tes Amadala 49a. So this matter was paskined already by the Tana de Rabbi Shua. The Tana de Rabbi Shua, V'neder Amona Ugrusha, Kol Asher Asra Al Nafsha Yakum Aleha. So we'll say, what does the Torah say? By Nedarim, if an Almana, a widow, or a Grusha, a divorcee, makes a neder, anything that she has prohibited upon herself, Yakum Aleha. Yakum Aleha means what? Shall remain upon her. Which means they're both saying that when you have a grusha or an almana, there's no one to annul her vows, right? There's no husband in the picture, so there's no one to annul her vows. Therefore, again, whatever vows she makes, by definition, stand. So the Gemara says, "Matam valo mutzas miklal av umutzas miklal baal." We'll say such a woman is removed from the domain of her father, because once a woman has nisuin, she is removed from the domain of her father, and of course she is removed from the domain of her husband. Now when we say she's removed from the domain of her husband, why? Why? Because either her husband is dead or divorced. Ella, rather, what must be the case? Shemasar, so we'll say, meaning, that would be obvious. That's obvious. Obviously, again, if a woman is divorced or a woman is widowed, of course, her nedarim are up to her. So it must be coming to teach us something additional as well. Watch this. Ella, rather, I will say it must be, here's the following case. Father gave his daughter over to the shluchim of the husband. Or the agents of the father gave her over to the agents of the husband. And now let's say on the way. So Rachel has never reached Reuven's home. On the way she is widowed. Onis Gersha. Or on the way Reuven divorces her. Hech ani koreba. So how do I categorize this girl? Beis avia shalzu or beis baila shalzu? In other words, whose home is she associated with? Is she associated with her husband's home? Is she associated with her father's home? Elalomar lecha kivan sheyatza sha'achas me'irshus ha'av shuv einu yachal lahaver. Rather, I will say it's fascinating. So again, this is another example. Rather, again, what do you see? What do you see from here? Once she leaves her father's home, she doesn't go back. Now we'll say, of course, she can go back and live there. That's not what it's saying. Halachically, once the father hands her over to the agents of the husband, she has halachically left her father's home. So I will say, what you begin to see what you begin to see is that halacha l'maisa, as the Mishnah said, once a father hands over his daughter to the shluchim of the Baal, that daughter has entered into the reshus of her husband. So to a certain degree, she becomes a quasi-nisua. When I say quasi-nisua, so remember, let's go through how does she become a nisua? Well, let's work backwards. Number one is that if she committed adultery, she gets chenek, like an nisua, and not skila, like an arusa. Number two, if she dies on the way, her husband inherits her. It's now, again, number three, once she leaves her father's home, father, for example, no longer has the right to annul her vows. Right? That's done. That's done. Sounds like husband would have the right to annul her vows. It seems to be the one area in which she's not considered to be like a full-fledged nisua is what? Truma. Good. So I'm not Papa. Afana nami tanina, we learned this as well. Haba al na'ara ha'me'urasa. If a man has relations with a na'ara ha'me'urasa, so we'll say, so again, this is talking about a girl, a na'ara, who is betrothed to someone else, right? Betrothed to someone else. So what happens? Eno chayiv achete na'ara besula me'urasa v'hi beveis aviha. So we'll say, so the particular din of na'ara ha'me'urasa has certain criteria. Number one, that she's a na'ara. Number two, that she's a besula. And number two, that she's living beveis aviha. So b'shlam na'ara, I understand na'ara, because na'ara means na'ara v'lo geres. Besula means besula v'lo ba'ula. Me'urasa means me'urasa v'lo nesua. Beveis aviha le'me'ute mai. What does it mean beveis aviha? In other words, what is it? What does that mean? What is that criteria? My lav le'me'ute masra av l'shluchei habal. It must say come to exclude what? A case of where the father already handed the girl over to the shluchim of the husband. Because once a girl, so we'll say, so for example, the particular halacha of na'ara ha'me'urasa, where again punishable by skila, and we learned this of na'ara ha'me'urasa. So again, the Torah goes out of its way to say that where is she? She's beveis aviha. So the Gemara is saying, what is beveis aviha? What is that halacha coming to go ahead and teach me, right? What is that coming to teach me? So ultimately, again, what it's coming to teach me is that halacha l'maisa, once comes to exclude where the father has handed over his daughter to the shluchim of the husband. Because ultimately, again, once that transfer has occurred, the girl has left her father's domain. If a man commits adultery, so we'll say, we just saw this halakha before. If a man has relations with a married woman, even if she has not yet had nisuin, meaning she has not yet, I should say differently, even though she has not yet had relations with her husband, so formal nisuin has not been effected, ultimately, again, if he has relations with her, that act of adultery is punishable by chenek. Now, let's go back for just a second. What is the punishment for committing adultery with an arusa? Arusa? Skila. Right? Punishment for committing adultery with an isua? Chenek. So what do you see from here? If a man commits adultery with a woman who has entered in, who has left with the shluchim of her husband, even though she has not yet had relations with her husband, she hasn't yet entered into chuppah with her husband, nevertheless, but the punishment for adultery with her is chenek. What do you see from here? That once a woman is handed over to the agents of her husband, to the shluchim of her husband, she has entered into rishus baila, and therefore again is already a quasi nisua. So the Gemara says, "Nichnas l'rishus abal ba'alma shmamina." So I'll say this is the conclusion of this sugya. So halacha l'maisa, again, what do we see? We see that indeed when a father goes ahead and hands over his arusa daughter to the shluchim of her husband. And I will say, now again, handing over his daughter to the shluchim of her husband means what? That what is the father doing? The father is withdrawing. Because what we've seen is like, if the father gives her over to the shluchim, but the father has some separation anxiety, right? So he goes in and he's accompanying his daughter the entire way. That's not called Mesira Labal. That's not called the giving over to the husband. But assuming the father gives over his daughter to the shluchim of the husband, and then the father stays away. So essentially, that girl becomes an Isua, again, in a number of different ways. Number one, for punishment purposes, adultery with her is punishable by chenek and not by skila. Number two, if she dies on the way, ultimately, again, the husband will inherit her, and but halacha l'maaseh seems to be the one area where she's not a nesua is going to be truma. Beautiful. We'll say Mishnah. This is an incredible sugya. Ha'av eno chai b'mizonos bito. A father is not obligated to support his daughter. Okay, so we'll say, so now what that statement means and where that statement came from is going to require a lot of explanation. And of course, what's missing from the Mishnah? What's missing from the Mishnah? What about sons? Good, we're going to see really fascinating sugya out of us. So watch this. Medrash Darsh Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Lefnei Chachamim. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah darshaned the following drasha before the Chachamim. If you take a look at Rashi says there is Zeb Medrash Darsh Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It's like about 20 lines up from the 4 lines get wide. So Biyom Shemanuhu Nasi. So we'll say this is incredible. On the day that they made Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah the Nasi, right, the head of the yeshiva, he darshan this darshan. Now I want to remember again. Remember, you know Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Like you remember Sechas Brachas. Harei Anika ben Shevim Shana. So you have to understand something. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is appointed Nasi at the age of 18. When he went ahead and he gave that first shir, right, in yeshiva, that was a big day. That was a big day. First of all, because remember again, he's a young guy, even though he looked old, right? Harei Anika ben Shevim Shana. I look like I'm 70, but everyone knew that he was really a young man. So here you have a young man, assuming he's taking over for the venerator of Gamliel, right? It was a huge power shift, So this is the drasha that he is delivering on the first day. So we'll say, what's the drasha? So listen to this. So Zeh Medrash Darash Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Lefnei Chachamim Bekerem B'Yavne. I will say Kerem B'Yavne literally means the vineyard in Yavne. What's the vineyard in Yavne? So again, Rashi says this in the base Medrash that was in Yavne. Why do they call the base Medrash? A kerem, a vineyard? Rashi says Hashem Shayoshvin Shuros Bekerem. Because remember again, they would sit by rows. So just like a vineyard has rows and rows of vines, so too again in the Medrash they made rows and rows of seats. So I will say, by the way, there's something beautiful in this also. You remember the Gemara Maseches Brachos? You remember that one of the things Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah did on his first day on the job is what did he do? Rabbi Gamliel had posted guards by the entranceway of the Beis Medrash. And he said the only people allowed in the Beis Medrash are who? People who are Tocho Kibaro. I only want genuine Talmidei Chachamim. Genuine people. You have to be genuine inside and out. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took away the guards, threw the doors of the Beis Medrash open, and the Gemara says so beautifully that day they had to add rows and rows of benches to the Beis Medrash. Kerem B'Yavne. I will say they had to add rows and rows because there were so many people who were kept out because of this high bar of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says that's not Yiddishkeit. We do not believe in an elitist religion. We are not elitist. We don't believe in an elitist Beis Medrash. Throw the doors open. Whoever wants to come in and learn. Kerem, they added on rows and rows of benches. The Kerem B'Yavne. So we'll say, so what was the drasha? Habanim Yirshu va'abanos Yazunu. The sons inherit and the daughters are supported. So we'll say we're going to see, interestingly enough, that this is, look at Rashi. We don't have time for this Rashi, but we always have to make time for Rashi. So look at this. Habanim Yirshu va'abanos. This is actually fascinating. Rashi says, so we'll say there are two different halachas, two takonas that Beis Din established by the ksuva of a woman. What are they? Habanim yirshu ksuvas benin dichrin. So we'll say there's a concept of benin dichrin. We're going to see this later on. Benin dichrin de'yahavan lechi minai. Inun yarsun kesav ksuvasei yeser al chalkeon de'ema chasun. V'hainu habanim yirshu ksuvas benin dichrin. So we'll say number one is the concept. Again, we're being introduced to this now. We're going to see later on. Benin dichrin. Benin dichrin literally means male sons. I will say it was written into a ksuva of a woman like this. Right, Rachel marries Ruvain. In her ksuva it says, "My sons will inherit my ksuva." And I will say, now what does that mean? What that means is like this. Rachel knows that Ruvain might marry someone else, and therefore there might be additional sons as well. So Rachel stipulated in her ksuva, or this was stipulated in every ksuva, what we call ksuvas b'nei dichrin, the ksuva of male sons, that a mother wants her sons to inherit her ksuva above and beyond whatever their share in their father's estate is going to be. So should I die, I want my sons to inherit my ksuva. That's called benin dichrin. And I will say that's takana number one, and we'll see all of this. That's takana number one. Takana number two, I will say, was that ultimately, again, va'abanos yazunu, so the sons inherit, and the daughters should be supported. What's this? Look at Rashi. Va'abanos yazunu, benin nukvan tiyahavon lechiminai, daughters that I have with you, inon yahavin yasvin bebeisiu mizin binichase aditis bagrun. And the banos yazun Rabbi say is that a mother would stipulate, my daughters are to be supported by you, by Reuben, by you or your estate, up until the time they reach bagrus or until they get married. So here you go. So now Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah darshaned banim yirshu, ultimately sons inherit, specifically the ksuva of their mother, va habanos yazunu, and daughters are supported by the estate. Now, just like sons only inherit when? After the death of their father. So too daughters are only supported when? After the death of their father. So remember again, this drasha supports the opening phrase of the Mishnah. What did the opening phrase of the Mishnah say? That a father is not chayiv to support his daughter. Okay? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah makes a drasha. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says we equate the inheritance of a son with the support of a daughter. Just like the inheritance of a son only comes when? Only comes when? After the death of a parent. Okay? Again, whether it's the death of a father, death of a mother, ultimately support of a daughter, obligatory support of a daughter is only triggered when? Upon the death of the father or upon the death of a parent. That is when the estate has to support them. Okay, good. We'll delve into this more. Says the Gemara, Mizonos pitu de'eno chayiv, haba mizonos beno chayiv. So we'll say it sounds like from the Mishnah that is only if a daughter who a father is not obligated to support, but a son he is obligated to support. So the Gemara says, hab mizonos beno chayiv, pito nami chovahu daleka ha mitzvah. To which the Gemara says, no. What the Mishnah means to say is like this. There may not be an obligation to support one's daughter, but there's certainly a mitzvah. So we'll say, so just to get our terms straight over in the Gemara. Chova means obligation. Mitzvah means something very good you should do, but not obligatory. So what the Gemara just posited was like this. The Mishnah is telling me, Ha'av eno chayiv b'mizonos pito. A father is not obligated. There is no obligation to support one's father, but the Gemara is positing there's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah. Whereas the Gemara might be saying is there may be a chiyuv to support one's sons. Okay, so the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. Mani mas nisin. Whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? Lo Rabbi Meir, lo Rabbi Yehuda, lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. It doesn't reflect any of these three opinions. Why not? Here we go. The Sanya, mitzvah lazon es habanos. Kavachomer lebanim da askim bator di Rabbi Meir. So both say Rabbi Meir holds it is a mitzvah. Both say now again, what does mitzvah mean? What does mitzvah mean? Something good. Something good you should do. It is a mitzvah to support your daughters. Kavachomer, it's a mitzvah to support your sons. Why? Because your sons have an obligation to learn Torah. Div Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, in Rabbi Meir's worldview, what's the nature of a support for children? What's the nature of a support? Mitzvah for both. In other words, there's no obligation to support sons or daughters, but it's a mitzvah to support your daughters, certainly a mitzvah to support your sons. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mitzvah lazon es habarim, kavachomer lebanos. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is a mitzvah to go ahead and support your sons, kavachomer the daughters. It's the reverse. The Gemara says, mishum zilusa. Ultimately, I will say, because ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, the daughters have to go ahead and beg, right, and go out and collect, it's degrading for them. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka Omer, chova lazun es habanos la'achar misa savian. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says there is an obligation to support daughters after the death of their father. But ultimately, again, during the lifetime of the father, neither sons or daughters are supported. So mani masnisin. Whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Rabbi Meir, if it's Rabbi Meir, ha'amar banim mitzvah, he said there's mitzvah for sons, right? And our Mishnah seemed to indicate that what? That there's an obligation for sons, right? Because the Mishnah doesn't even discuss sons. So the Mishnah just says, there is no obligation to support your daughter. So the logical inference from the Mishnah is what? There is an obligation to support your sons. So it came to Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir holds there's no obligation even for sons, there's just a mitzvah. Rabbi Huda, ha'amar banim nami mitzvah. If it's Rabbi Huda, he holds banim are also a mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan Baroka, filu mitzvah nami leka. Rabbi Yochanan Baroka says not even a mitzvah. So whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Ibai saying Rabbi Meir, Ibai saying Rabbi Huda, Ibai saying Rabbi Yochanan Baroka. So the Gemara wants to suggest the truth is, you could read all three opinions into the Mishnah. How so? Here we go. Ibai saying Rabbi Meir, maybe it's Rabbi Meir. V'achi kamer, this is what it means to say, ha'av eno chayiv b'mizonos bito. A father is not obligated in the mizonos of his daughter. That's the Mishnah, right? A father is not obligated to support his daughter. V'hu adin libno. And ultimately, he's not obligated for his son either. Ha mitzvah bebito ika. But there is a mitzvah to support his daughter. Kavachomer lebanim. Ultimately, again, for sons as well. V'hadik tani bito. So why does the Mishnah single out daughter if there's no obligation really to support anyone? Ha kamash malan da'afilu amud beis. Da'afilu bito chovahu deleka ha mitzvah ika. It singles out daughter to teach you that there's no obligation for daughter, but there still is a mitzvah. Okay, so that's how the Mishnah can read according to Rabbi Meir. Ibai same Rabbi Huda. Or the other possibility is, it could be Rabbi Huda. V'achi kamar, this is what it means to say. V'achi kamar. Ha'av eino chay b'mizonos bito, a father is not obligated in the support of his daughter. V'chol shekain libno. And all the more so, right, v'chol shekain is certainly not obligated in his son. Ha-mitzvah bebinoika, but there is a mitzvah for his son. Kavachomer lebanos. Ultimately, again, a kavachomer, there's a mitzvah for the daughters. V'hadik tani bito, and that why did the Mishnah single out bito? Hakamashlan da'afilu bito chovaleka, to teach me ultimately again that even by daughter, there is no obligation. Okay, you could also read the Mishnah like Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. How so? What it means to say, a father is not obligated in the mizonos of his daughter. V'hu adin libno. And ultimately, again, this is the din. This is the din, ultimately, for his son. So the Gemara says, he's not high for either of them. Din da'afilu mitzvah nami laka. And then Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka would say, there's not even a mitzvah to support one's children. Va'aidi debanos la'achar misas avien chova, tana nami eno chayiv. But since ultimately, again, there is an obligation after the death of the father to support the daughters, therefore the Mishnah phrased it in the form of chova. Okay, so Shabbos says, halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, again, it appears that one could read the Mishnah in accordance with any of the opinions. But I will say, here's what becomes clear. What becomes clear is that the Mishnah is teaching me there is no obligation to support one's daughters. The machlokes, again, is going to be halacha l'maisa. Number one, well, is there an obligation to support sons? Right, so that by itself is a machlokes. And if you hold there's no obligation to support sons or daughters, is there at least a concept of a mitzvah, that it is a good thing to do? So both say, now the Gemara takes a sharp turn. Watch this. Amr Rabbi Amr Yishlagish Rabbi Yehuda bar Chanina. Ba'usha hiskinu. Now both saying usha. Now what's going on in usha? Look at Rashi. Third line down from the top. Ba'usha hiskinu. Kishiyashvu Sanhedrin ba'usha shi'a'achos me'eser galios shagolsa Sanhedrin kedom rashana. So I will say, when the Sanhedrin left the Lishkas Hagozis, when they left the chamber of hewn stone by the Beis Hamikdash, this is Second Temple era, they went ahead and they were exiled in 11 different places. One of the places they were exiled in was in Usha. So we'll say, so a number of incredible takanas came out in Usha. So one of the things they legislated in Usha is incredible. We'll say, we get ready for this. Busha eskinu she adam zan esbana v'espinosav kishem kitanim. They made a takana in Usha. And what was the takana in Usha? You have to support your kids. Now, how long do you have to support your kids? Kishem kitanim. Now, both say, what does that mean? Right? Is this a halachic katan? right? Is this a katan, a boy, right, until 13, a girl until 12? So we're going to see. I have incredible Yetzer Hara to jump to the Rambam now, but I'm going to resist. I'm working on myself. I'm going to resist. So we'll come back to this a little bit, because we're going to see, ultimately, we're going to look at the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam in this, because halacha l'maisa, again, the Rambam's verbiage over here, I'm doing it. Okay, no, we're going to go weiter. Okay, so here's what we have. So we have a Mishnah that tells me that halacha l'maisa, you don't have to support your daughters, okay, at all. We're then now we see in Usha, a new takana, you have to support your kids until they are while they're ketanim. How old? What level of support? And by the way, we'll say, who does this cover? Which kids? This sounds like both boys and girls, right? But there's no distinction, sons, daughters. Okay. Ibailahu, hilchas hakavase or ein hilchas hakavase. So we'll say, so now, they made halacha and Usha that you have to support your kids. Does the halacha follow that or not? So here we go. Tashma, we'll say, this is incredible. So now that's the shayla. So we'll say, so now we have a Mishnah. I just want to point out what's happening. I have a Mishnah that says, I have no obligation to support my daughters. Okay. Now we see three-way machlokes, whether or not they even have an obligation to support my sons. Usha, atakana, you have to support your minor children. Whatever katan means, we'll get to that. You have to support your katan. So does the halacha follow that or not? So we'll say, this is absolutely incredible. Look at these gemaras. Hilchas hakavase in hilchas hakavase. Does the halacha follow this takana in Usha or not? So Tashma, get ready for this. Wild. When they came up for Rabbi Yehuda, Amar lahu yarod yalda v'abnei masa shadja. Well, so let me give you the context over here. So ultimately, again, look at Rashi. Tashma, the less hilchas hakavase ela meimra amrina le v'lei chagay. And they're both saying, now, here's what I want to point out. When the Gemara says that does the halacha follow this takana in Usha, what's the question? We'll say the question is, if we have a case of a father who's not supporting his kids, can we go ahead and extract money from him for the support of his family? Say if the halacha follows that takana in Usha, the answer is yes. If not, then we can't extract. The most we could do is what? There is a very powerful tool to get people to do things, and it is public shaming, right? Social pressure. So we'll say, so here's the case. There was a guy, Kiava Asukala Kamed Rabbi Huda. There was a guy who was not supporting his kids. He wasn't supporting his kids. He came before Rabbi Huda, Amar Lahu, so Rabbi Huda said about this guy, Yarod Yolda, Va'abne Masa Shajeh, the jackal has given birth, and he's left his young to the community. I will say now, apparently, the jackal, Rashi says, Buach Zari Albana. I guess apparently the jackal is not kind to its young. So Rabbi Huda comes along and he says about this guy, the jackal. He's calling him a jackal in public, and now the community has to support the jackal's kids. When this guy, again, another guy who wasn't supporting his kids, came before Rav Chisda, Amar Lahu, Kafi Le'asisa, do me a favor, take the mortar, turn over the mortar, right? Bitsibura. I mean, essentially what Rabbi Huda is saying is, give me a soapbox, right? Take the mortar, turn it over. I'm going to stand up on it in public. V'leikum v'leima urva boi bani. V'higavra lo boi bani. Even the raven has compassion upon its kids. This guy doesn't have compassion upon his kids. So I'll say, what's happening over here? These are cases of public shaming. So these great rabbanim were shaming these deadbeat dads into going ahead and taking care of their kids. So the Gemara says, by the way, v'orva bai bani, really, the raven has compassion upon its kids. V'ksiv, we learn, libnei orva shalo yikro, I'll say the pasuk in Tilim. No sin levei ma lachma, Hashem gives food to the animal, livnei orva shayikru, to the children of the raven who call out. But apparently the idea is that what? That the parent, right, the mother, the father raven, don't take care of their kids. Cheshbon Baruch Hu does take care of them. To which the word is Lokashia. This is incredible. Habichivri habeochmi. One is talking about a white raven. One is talking about a black raven. What's the pshat? We both say, take a look at Rashi. This is actually quite fascinating. Rashi says over here, Uchmi kishegat. We both say, apparently, when the raven is born, it's white. So the black parents don't recognize the white raven. In other words, it's fascinating. In other words, that halacha l'maisa, when the child is born, right, the child doesn't look like the parent. So because of that, there's a certain degree of alienation from the child. As the raven gets older, I guess the pigmentation changes, it's black, it begins to look like the parent, then the parent has rachmanas on it. It's incredible. Rashi says, Uchmi, kishagadol mashchir, as the raven gets older, it darkens, v'ha'av v'ha'im oavin oson. And ultimately, again, the father and the mother love it. Aval maschilin lebanim, aval mitchilasan levanim, or levanim. In the beginning, ultimately, again, the raven is white. V'sonin also, and therefore the parents despise it. Which I will say, such a profound yesod of how parental love cannot be predicated on my child doing exactly what I want and how I want them to do it. That's raven love, right? Raven love is when you look like me, you behave like me, you do like me, then I'll love you. But if you don't look like me, you don't behave like me, you don't do like me, I don't love you. That's not a way to love a child. A parent's love for a child has to be unconditional. Even at the end of the day, when the child does not look like me, when the child does not behave like me, when the child does not chas v'shalom follow in my ways, when the child does not do the right things in life, I love my child because my child is my child. Again, does parental love, ebb and flow? Does it have peaks and valleys? Of course. Is it the same, or does it manifest itself in the same way for every child? Of course not. But it's so profound. Raven love is conditional, right? Raven love is conditional on the child being exactly like the parent. Real parental love has to be an unconditional. Such an incredible yesod. So the Gemara says, okay, so leaving ravens aside, when these deadbeat fathers would come before Rava, Amrlei, so Rava gave them musar. Rava would say, tell me, do you think your children should be supported by tzedakah? Right? So Rava would say, now what do you see from here? What do you see from all these cases? What do you see from here? What was the tool that these Rabbanim had? What was the tool? Shaming. What was the tool apparently it didn't have? Seizing of assets. Which tells you that what? It doesn't appear that the halacha was like the takana and usha. Or so we'll say, which is really fascinating, because what do you mean the halacha is not like the takana and usha? If they make a takana and usha, that's what the halacha is. It sounds like, although they made a takana and usha, it sounds like what? It didn't take. That's just, again, we're going to see what the halacha lamais is, but it's fascinating that it seems just like societally, they had difficulty implementing this halacha. And therefore, again, I'll say, obviously also, so it sounds like a difficulty implementing the halacha. So therefore, again, the tool that was used was public shaming. Below Amran, Nabosai, this idea that we don't force, or we can't force a father to support his children is only when Ela de lo Amid. Bosai de lo Amid means is, we don't know if the father has money or not. Aval Amid. Nabosai, let's say we know the father has money. We know the father has money, right? Halacha, however we know, then kafina le'al karche. Then ultimately we will force a father to support his kids. So the Gemara says, Kiyad the Rava, kafi l'Rav Nasan bar Ami, va'afik minei dala meya zuzid tzedakah. As Rava forced Rabbi Nasan bar Ami, and I will say, Rabbi Nasan bar Ami wasn't a deadbeat father. This is a different case. He forced Rabbi Nasan bar Ami to give tzedakah. Rava said, in other words, there's a concept of kofen alat tzedakah. That halacha l'maisa, again, if the community needs funds, and you know that somebody needs funds and they're not paying their share, you could force them to pay in an organized community. Rabbi say, well, if you think about it, if there's a child that needs to be supported and he's not being supported, you could force the father to go ahead and support him if you know the father has money, because that's no different than kolfen al tzedakah. So interesting. So although it appears that in a general case, they could not force a father to support. They could shame a father into supporting. However, if we know for sure that the father has resources, in that case, you can force him, you can compel him to pay. Amr Bilai, Amr Ishlakish, Bu'usha Eskinu. Both say, so again, we're gonna do the halacha l'maisa. We're gonna do the halacha l'maisa on that sugya tomorrow, because I'm telling you, it's riveting. It's absolutely riveting. So let's just go a little bit weiter. Another takana and usha. Hakosef kanachasav labanov huve ishnu zunimam. Let's say interesting takana. If a man goes ahead and gives over his entire estate to his children while he's alive, then I will say, by the way, you'll ask yourself, well, why would anyone do that? I'll say, well, people do it today, right? It's a what's the word? tax planning thing, right? Where again, if a person's going to need long-term care, this is free advice, by the way. This is free, right? If a person needs going to need long-term care, there's like a look-back period for moving. Okay, all these different things. So a father and a mother are giving over their entire estate to their children while they're still alive. In Usha, they made a takana that ultimately, again, hiskinu, that what? That hu v'ishtoni zonim mehem. That the parents are still supported by the estate. In other words, even though my wife and I have given over our entire estate to our children, in Usha they said the parents are still supported by the estate. We'll say, we'll stop over here. Again, Baruch Hashem, I think we're caught up with the rest of the Daf Yomi world for the most part. Let's say, so we'll start over here today. So tomorrow, coming attractions, more incredible takanas of Usha. I'm telling you, incredible. Incredible. And Emir Hashem, the halacha l'maisa on the din of supporting one's children, all tomorrow. Shkar Chabosai. All right, everyone on Zoom, everyone have a great day. Thank you, Rashi.